we'll do something better next time. We'll just keep it brief, and keep us humble. This keeps us humble.
Well, I'm sorry also. Okay, well, I'll keep going. I was just saying that the global leadership profile is a measure. Some of you have seen it. It's a measure where you're given 30 sentence stems, short beginnings of sentences, and then you fill out the rest of it any way you want to. And from that, in a very complex way, a score is given, and each score represents a kind of leadership action logic, a way that you typically behave as a leader, and based on a theory that says that we can progress to wider and wider ways of leading that take more and more things into account and are therefore more likely to be timely. That is, that the way you're responding really helps the situation you're in, rather than it's just the way you always respond to every situation. And in a way, you could say that this developmental theory of leadership describes how a person can come to the point of really being able to exercise action inquiry, to be aware enough of themselves, of the group that they're with right now, and of how that group is nested in a wider system, so that our actions not only accomplish our own purposes, but also accomplish the purpose of the group and also the purpose of the larger system. Or else perhaps they reveal that there's something incongruous or misaligned between the systems, and you gain the ability to name what that is in a way that could help the system to correct itself. So that's the most basic idea about that measure and theory. Now, I could begin talking a little bit about how I came to become interested in this theory or develop it, but let me just stop for a minute and check with all of you and with Ala. Maybe you want to ask one or two other questions right away about action inquiry or this measure.
I'll ask a question. Есть ли вопросы? Понятно? Или могу говорить по-английски? Как те, кто меня слышит с языком? Ну, я не слышу. Я вас не слышу.
Ну, достаточно сложно.
Ага. Сложно, Александр, да? А вам, Александр Крылов, тут два Александра. Вы понимаете?
Нет, все понятно и, в принципе, все ясно. Даже можно чуточку побыстрее. Единственное, что есть перебой со связью, это единственная проблема.
Хорошо, тогда, Александр, вы слушаете?
Алло.
Да. Можно сказать, вопросов нет, да? Можно продолжать. Он расскажет сейчас, как он пришел лично к этой теории. We're good. I just had to check in Russian.
Okay. I thought that probably the most important period of my life I could tell you about was the period when I discovered this theory, the theory both of individual development and of organization development, because that's also a very important part of my work. And that was just after I graduated from college. I was at Yale in the 1960s, and I was still in New Haven, where Yale is. And after 1 year of work, I began going to graduate school but also starting a program called the Yale Upward Bound Program, which was for students from poverty backgrounds who often dropped out of school. 2/3 of the students were black. And this whole period in the 1960s, as some of you may know, was a period of great tension in the United States. The civil rights movement, I was very much a part of it because our chaplain at Yale was one of the leaders with Martin Luther King of that movement. And then there was the anti-Vietnam War movement, which I was also a part of. So we were very much working on a societal level, trying to confront the incongruities. And then when I started this school, we were working with students who were not good students. They were angry students, made even angrier by the Black Power movement. And so I was trying to learn, how do you work with people who are very different from yourself and who don't necessarily share your assumptions about life, and who, if you tell them what to do, they're going to go the other way or fight you. So how do you create a glue that brings together these people who are fighting with each other? And during the 2 years that I ran this school, we ran it very collaboratively. The students made a lot of the decisions with the faculty, which is what made the students trust the faculty more. At the same time, we sometimes were too collaborative. I learned that, yes, you do have to give direction some of the time. And in fact, there's the paradox that you sometimes need to unilaterally insist in order to keep the collaborative framework. That is, because somebody else is trying to destroy the collaborative framework, either the student or a faculty member. And so when I studied for my dissertation at Yale, I studied the 2 years that I had run this program. We tape recorded a lot and we had many questionnaires. So I had a lot of data about the 2 years. And I wanted to find out the mistakes I had made as a leader. Why did I make those mistakes? Why was it the wrong time to do that? And that's what led to the theory of organizational transformation that you find in my Action Inquiry book in the later chapters. And then I was also very interested in the question of, it seemed to me that my faculty, the people who worked with me, were in some ways more difficult to work with than the students, even though the faculty was supposed to be on my side and was supposed to be well educated and excited about helping the students. Very often the faculty members had a fixed idea of how the students, of what would be helpful to the students. And the faculty member, if the student didn't like the way the conversation was going, the only thing the faculty member knew how to do was to try to force the person to do it their way. And I literally got hit in the back of the head with a chair at one point and was bleeding from the back of the head. So I had real wounds that I really needed to learn how to do it a little bit better. So that was so I became interested in the individual development because I wanted to understand why my faculty members had such a difficult time questioning their own assumptions about how to teach and how to lead. And so the individual development theory showed me, well, people, young adults very often, and in fact most adults in our society, reach the expert or achiever level. So most of you are a little familiar with the theory, so you'll recognize these words maybe. But the expert and achiever levels don't question their own assumptions. They can be very smart and very capable, and most people that we score today who are adults score at those levels, but they resist transformation. They don't like the questioning of assumptions. Most people don't like that. We don't like to have to change our minds totally. So that theory helped me to understand that, and later I began to use this measure to try to see the GLP, to try to see whether my ideas were right in an empirical sense, and so we can discuss more about that. So that's just a little bit about my life at that time. I don't know, again, let's check and see if people have questions you want to ask, or if people get the idea, basically.
I think my team here. Maybe there is any questions, or no, we're good. Then I switch. Какие-то вопросы есть? Ну,
Пока нет.
Пока нет. We're good so far.
Okay. Well, I'll go on then to your next question, which was, what is the relevance of taking the GLP for leadership, especially in a small business environment?
Right.
And most of my consulting during my life was actually in small businesses later, when I became a professor and a consultant. And most of my work was with businesses between 30 people and 900 people. One of the pieces of research we did was on 10 businesses like that, and we found that only the ones who had leaders who were beyond this achiever action logic, leaders who were willing to question their own assumptions, only those leaders were able to lead the organization as a whole in a transformation. So, in small business, you actually go through a number of transformations in the early years of the business if it is going to be successful in the first place and then remain successful. So, and different things, different ways of leading are necessary at each of the organizational stages. So only the leader at a late stage can choose between ways of leading and say, for this meeting or this time, I need to be more firm and more directive. And at this other time, I need, and the leadership team needs, to be more open to suggestions and experiments by all the members in the business. So, for example, one of the things that was very valuable for me to realize, because I was more biased towards being collaborative. It seemed to me that was what most businesses had too little of, and most schools and all organizations. But I gradually realized that in organization development, it goes back and forth between needing to be more centralized and more decentralized. So, and I realized that at the early stage of development, when a business is getting going, at what I call the incorporation stage, where it first produces products and makes them available to the market, at that time, a very directive form of leadership is necessary. There's often emergencies because there's not enough money to keep going unless we get the product out soon. And I've used the organization development theory not only to look at how a whole organization is advancing, but how a particular project, a new project, how is that developing? And I've realized I have to be very aware of that point where you first need to get something to your market. The market may not be the business market. It might be your students if you're leading a class. And you have to make a number of decisions and be quite decisive at that point. But if it works, if you're successful in the market, you then need to begin developing additional products or services to support your original product. And you need help from other people besides yourself to develop these services and products. So you need to go into this experiment stage where it's more decentralized. So this is what first of all, I think the organization development theory is very useful for a small business person. And then the individual development theory is important because you won't be able to do the organization leadership if you're not at one of the later action logics that recognizes that at different times, different styles are needed. So that's a first idea about why the GLP might be useful. Maybe I'll say one more idea about that, and then check for questions. I think it's also very useful for the top team in a small business. If you have a top team of 3 or 4 or 5, 6 people, that team is going to have a tremendous effect. How that team works together and relates to the other employees is going to have an immense effect on whether the employees are willing to transform or not. So the individual action logics of the team members are important. Their willingness to work on their own development is important. The team action logic is important. You can look at the pattern of how the team is working, and it may be at a lower level than the individual action logics of the team members, so they could bring up the team performance if they're willing to give one another feedback about what's working and what's not working among them. So again, there's a lot in my book, Action Inquiry, of exercises that senior team members can try. It's not just a matter of taking the GLP. Of course, you have to debrief that instrument and set development goals for the individual senior team members. So it takes quite a lot of energy and effort, and it's hard for business senior teams to do this because, of course, you've got a million other things that want your attention. And to give enough emphasis, and this again is what only somebody at a later action logic will realize, it's worth investing the time in this development for the longer range success of the business. So that's just saying a little bit about the use of this theory with a senior team. Again, let's pause and see if people want to raise questions or...
May I ask questions? You said that sometimes teams' action logic could be lower than the action logic of individuals. Is there any way to test collective organizational action logic?
Well, we don't have as formal a measure that's as scientifically validated as the GLP, but we have a very practical little measure, and I think you probably have a copy of it, Ala, in the set of handouts that I gave out at the workshop, and you're welcome. I'll be glad to send it again so that your friends can look at it. What this is just 2 pages that give a paragraph description of each team action logic. And so it's possible for a senior team, for each member of the senior team to read through those paragraphs and say what they think the senior team's action logic is. And then you can get together and see whether you agree with one another. And if you don't, fight it out until you reach a little agreement. And then are you happy with that? Are you happy with that action logic? Or would you like to see the team at a later action logic? So it can be, it's not really an instrument, it's a tool for a live senior team to use, and can be helpful in setting goals for how the team could work together differently. So
but if I don't,
I'll be glad to send you that if you don't, if you want. I can just send it very easily. So don't spend a lot of time looking for it.
okay. All right. Any questions? Any questions?
Yes.
Bill, I'm wondering, did you ever, or were you ever approached by the military to assess the military leadership qualifications?
Well, I did. I was approached by the National Security Agency, the NSA, and we used the measure with their talent pool, the 50 people most likely to be promoted to senior management in the next year. Unfortunately, the GLP revealed that none of those 50 people was beyond the achiever stage, which is not really surprising, but it was quite upsetting to the NSA. They chose not to continue using the measure because they preferred measures that gave them better news than our measure gave them. So that's the. I have spoken at the Army War College, but they haven't adopted the measure either.
Well, I suspect that they're stuck in the directive mode.
Yes, of course. I mean, and you often think that military structures are necessarily command structures, pyramids. Actually, research shows that doesn't have to be so true, and that it's often better if there's better communication between the front line and the command line. But and the U.S. military, the Army, has been going through a program which they call, I can't remember exactly, I think they just call it Transform. And the idea is that they're trying to transform the military, but because they're not using a particular theory of transformation, everybody makes up their own story about what transformation means. So you don't get very far that way.
Thank you.
In Russian, по-русски есть вопросы?
Да, на самом деле есть вопрос. Если мы говорим о организациях, именно которые были исследованы, какое основное количество людей, именно какого типа, он встречал в различных сферах? То есть какой типаж применителен более для различных направлений?
Не совсем поняла. Какой типаж для различных? Не совсем.
Если мы говорим, допустим, о строительном бизнесе, я более чем уверен, что там, конечно, больше всего именно экспертов и...
Поняла.
Да.
Okay. The question is, in your research, does it show what kind of, what type or what action logic is more typical, more common for different kinds of industrial segments? Is there any relationship you noticed?
No, we don't have, even though we by this time have over 10,000 measures of people in different organizations, we don't have enough from particular industries to be able to answer that question. What we do have is and I doubt there would be significant. I will say that my estimate is, or my imagination is, that there wouldn't be very much difference among industries. What we do find is that there is a difference of the level of the person is at. And so oddly enough, even though people in industry and not-for-profits and government don't know about the developmental theory, they seem to promote people more if they are at later action logics. So the people who are first-line supervisors are predominantly diplomats, which is a lower action logic. And then the people who are junior managers are predominantly experts. And more senior managers are predominantly achievers, with just a very, very few people beyond that at redefining or transforming. Those are rare, but almost all of the ones that we measure are at senior management levels. So it seems as though, in a general way, when you move to later action logics, you get rewarded by the existing systems, even though they're not quite sure what they're rewarding. I think. So that's the best I can do on that.
But Bill, doesn't it, in the test with the NSA, what does it say about the people who are about to promote those people? Because if everybody rated out at the same thing, it would seem to me that the culture and environment of NSA was such that it allowed you to grow only so far and not to move beyond that. So I guess we don't have any information as how the supervisors would have rated.
Well, right, and most organizations are that way. I mean, I think that the dominant capitalist business action logic is the achiever action logic, and it's hard to develop beyond that and stay in the organization or to feel welcome in an organization. Most people who are beyond achiever and are in organizations will often say, I feel like I'm a spy in this organization, or like I'm from an alien planet and I have to put on a mask and be very careful. Or as one very, very successful late action logic person put it, he said, I have to bring in $50 million worth of business a year to be allowed to have my opinions. I'm allowed to influence things only because I'm such a good achiever. But then he has other goals in mind. So it is difficult. And in fact, we find that a lot of people who leave organizations to set up their own consulting firms, we find that they measure at the redefining action logic just beyond achiever. So they become dissatisfied with the culture they're in. They no longer feel supported, and they leave. And it's difficult for organizations to retain people who develop beyond achiever unless the organization itself becomes a late stage organization, which some of you may know about this book called Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux, but he's researched a whole group of organizations, several dozen organizations that operate in a much more collaborative, consensus, creative way than a typical organization does. And people at late action logics love those organizations, and people in the achiever and expert action logics tend not to like those organizations. There's too much confusion. There isn't enough clarity about what they're supposed to do, and there's too much feedback. Everybody's allowed to give everybody else feedback, and you have to even listen to people who are below you in the hierarchy to their feedback, and people get irritated. Didn't I earn my right to be the boss? Do I have to listen to these people? So it's a difficult transition. I mean, in a way, as we become globalized and everybody is exposed to people who are really different from one another, just this meeting itself, here we are very cross-cultural, in a sense, we all realize more than ever that we are making assumptions that other people don't make. The whole globalization process is an engine that supports development beyond achiever. But since most people most people don't want to face that, so there's a lot of reaction against. There couldn't really be climate change. That couldn't be true, because it would force to admit it or to take it seriously would force us into an entirely different set of assumptions about how we work. So I think we're at a meeting between two ages of civilization. We're leaving the modern age, which has developed since 1500, and we don't yet know how to do this global age.
I have a quick question. Do you find that structured organizations, the lower the action logic level, being that, if I worked at Apple or I worked in the military, I would assume the risk-taking is higher in certain kinds of corporations that encourage that, whether you fail or succeed. However, in a very structured organization, I've worked in both types, I would think you would be a little bit more pinned down to not be able to do certain things that may result in good results.
No, I think that's absolutely true. Unfortunately, I don't have the data to prove it, but although we can't distinguish, I don't think it, no matter how much data we developed, I don't think we'd distinguish industries as a whole in terms of how much, but for individual companies, yes, Google, Apple, or some, of course, a completely different kind of organization, the Wikipedia, is not even an organization in the traditional sense. It doesn't pay most of its people, and so forth. So those kinds of organizations will attract probably more later and be more comfortable, and they require more risk-taking in general, and they will tend to attract later action logic people. Of course, they'll also attract sort of techie geeks who may be at the expert level, but that, at a low level, that works out all right. If they start getting promoted to higher positions and they are still at the expert action logic, they will become they will cause difficulties for their subordinates probably.
I think in the 60s we call that the Peter principle.
That's right. Yes, you get promoted to your level of incompetence, right? That's right, and that in a sense, that fits perfectly with developmental theory. In other words, it isn't simply, if you reward people simply on their current abilities and accomplishments rather than on their capacities, which is what developmental theory is looking at, then you're going to inevitably promote people beyond the level that they have the capacity to act successfully at. So, yes, there is that tendency. Now let's see. I'll go ahead to the next question if people are ready.
I think there is one more question. Andrei, English or Russian? How are you going to speak? Oh, we can hear you.
Okay.
Andrei, we cannot hear you. Вас не слышим. English, thank you.
Yeah, great question. We once, for a couple of years, measured all of our MBA students at Boston College, and we had them in project teams where they were working with real clients and trying to make real changes in the clients. And we found that if the team had a single person who was post-achiever in Action Logic, those teams, and there were about a quarter of the teams that had such a person, those teams not only did the best, they did the best in grades, they did the best in terms of the client responding positively to them, and they did the best in terms of the satisfaction inside the team. A team that did not have anybody that was post-achiever and that was dominated by people at the expert level, they had a lot of conflict because experts, of course, are experts in different things. So each one thinks their thing is the more important, marketing or finance or accounting. And so experts get into a lot of fights with each other, whereas achievers are more interested in producing something as a group than in winning an argument. But of course, it's possible that two achievers have very different personalities. One's an introvert, one is an extrovert, and of course, two people at the same Action Logic can have fights and be enemies, but it's somewhat less likely than people at different Action Logics. Because at the same Action Logic, you're kind of speaking the same language at least, whereas at different Action Logics, you mean different things by the same words. You're headed toward different goals without quite realizing it. So yes, it makes a big difference, I think, what the composition of the team is, but that's the kind of difference. Okay, we ready to go? I'll just let's see. The next question was, why do leaders regress during drastic changes in their life, such as relocating to a different country, an issue that a lot of you are concerned about, I guess. Well, first of all, I would just so that you'll know I'm an academic, I will quarrel with one word in that and say it's we don't think they regress in the sense that they are no longer capable of what they were capable of before, but that they fall back temporarily, and that they have a perfectly good likelihood of returning, that they still have the capacities of the later Action Logic, but because they're missing some of the elements like language, maybe language is a problem, there's some things that in a way they have to start over again on when there's a drastic change. That's what we mean by drastic change. I think this is another place where I think the organizational theory can be very helpful when you're starting over again in some sense. You can go much faster through the stages than you did the first time in your life because you've already been through it. And if you know the organizational stages, you can kind of give the right amount of time to the early stages. Some people believe, people naturally imagine, say I was a doctor in Syria and I have sought refuge in Europe, and so they think, well, I have to become a doctor as soon as possible. And it's, of course, very difficult to become a doctor because you have to know the language really well and you have to learn new rules and laws about how things are to be done. And so really it's quite a slow process, and you'll probably have to do something else besides being a doctor for a while. And the organizational stage theory helps you realize, yes, you have to sort of reconceive what you are going to be. Then you have to invest. That's the second stage in the organizational sequence. You have to invest a lot. You have to, for example, learn, so I'm going to put a lot of time into learning the language. I need to develop a circle of colleagues and acquaintances who know this new situation well. I should devote a lot of time early on to developing relationships before I can expect to reach any productive goals. I guess that's. I guess I'm making it. The question also was asking what would be my suggestions for dealing with such situations. So one suggestion is to look carefully at the organizational transformation theory and ask yourself, okay, what am I doing to go through each of these steps? The middle stage is systematic productivity. That would be like, okay, now I'm a doctor again and I'm working in a hospital, but you're going to have to go through those early stages in order to be successful. If you try to jump right away to becoming a doctor, you're going to be undermined by your lack of the new skills that you need. So I guess that's the first thoughts about that.
I just want to make a comment that, Andre, your company in the United States is going through early stages as we speak, I believe, right? So we're in the process of creating a business plan. So maybe it would be wise for us to incorporate organizational theory into the business plan and see how the company can benefit from those stages, to ask ourselves the question, what are we doing to, look at each stage and ask ourselves this question, I believe. Would you agree on it? Right? With the help of our US talent team, right? I can say. All right. I just wanted to it just dawned on me that we could take a look at it simultaneously with the creation of our business plan. The company just opened up a bank account. We did that. So now we're doing some research already. It's a pretty substantial company in technological. All right, I just wanted to make that comment.
Bill, I have another question for you. Let's assume that the NSA engaged you as a consultant. Do you have programs for moving people from one stage to another?
Well, probably not. Well, let's see. It sounds more formal than what I've got, so I was going to say no, but I think I'll say yes.
Okay.
Instead. because in fact, in my consulting and when I worked at the Boston College MBA program, we had a whole series of processes that we implemented for precisely this purpose. So, for example, one element is getting people to really look closely at their difficult conversations with other people. So you have some relationships that are more difficult for you, and we have a whole system of looking at conversations so that you begin to become more aware. Of course, you think it's the other person's fault that you're having difficulty in the conversation, but unfortunately, the only person you have real control over is yourself. So we look at these conversations and try to look at how we could act differently in order to have a different outcome in the conversation. The whole process of looking carefully at what our assumptions have been as we went into the conversation at first are very developmental in nature. People switch their assumptions. We have people role play a different way of conducting the conversation. It's not enough to give a person advice about how to do the conversation differently, because everybody forgets the advice once they're in the conversation. The only thing that people remember is if they've role played it, if you've really done it with your own body and your own voice, and you've seen and gotten feedback about how different that is. So role playing alternatives is a very important help for development. But then we also create we ask everybody in a meeting of whatever small team you belong to. If you have 5 or 6 members on a team, everybody on the team can hold a leadership position for the team. One person can be in charge of the agenda for each meeting. Another person can be in charge of making sure the team follows through on decisions between meetings. Another person can be the person who assesses how well the meetings go with a little 5-minute assessment at the end of the meeting. Another person can be the process leader who is in charge of intervening if the meeting seems to be slowing down or not reaching agreement. And all of these involve quite a lot of leadership skills, and the leadership roles can be rotated over time so that everybody learns all the skills. And of course, the meetings change because there isn't just one leader to the meeting. Everybody's a leader, so everybody can really influence it. So there's a number of other elements, but those are some things. In other words, we try to, the program is not a program so much where you take people away from their jobs and train them. It's where you have people look at how they're actually conducting their jobs or doing their jobs and do it differently. So it's a lot less expensive than major leadership programs that make people go away for a week or 3 days. And you can do most of it on the job if the management is sufficiently committed to it. And just to follow up on that, we did research on whether we succeeded in transforming our MBA students. And we were terribly disappointed because after we spent $50,000 on a grant and spent 3 years researching, our first finding was that only 10% of the students in the program changed, developed to a later action logic. And that was a bad day in my life when I learned that result. But a few days later, I said to myself, well, who were those 10% that changed? I was so depressed by the initial finding that it took me a few days to ask this question. And we learned that all of the people who changed were the people who became, the MBA program was 2 years long, and all of our programs, like what I've just been describing to you, were in the first year. But what we learned was the only people who changed were the people who, after the first year, volunteered to be consultants during the second year to the new teams, the new first-year teams. And they also volunteered to take a summer course, and they went into much more detail than we could go with all 100 first-year students. These 10 students all ended up transforming to a later action logic. So what we learned was, first of all, it takes a long time. It takes maybe 2 years of effort to do this. But more importantly, we learned that people really have to volunteer for it. The first year students were required to take the program, but the second year consultants were volunteers. In fact, we created a competition. It was it was hard to become one of the people selected. And so that's been very important in my advice to companies ever since then, is that you want to create programs that people volunteer for, and they're going to have to, it's not like given to them. So that's, I think, an important, and it was an important lesson to me in terms of you cannot, no matter how good your program is, it will not force development. Development has to be volunteered for, as well as, so there has to be a mutuality. The person has to volunteer, and there has to be a real program for them at the same time.
I'm not supposed to comment this way, but I thought that was a terrific answer. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Or maybe I am supposed to comment that way, but that was very, very helpful.
Right.
That's uncommon for organizational development to think in those terms, and very helpful to do so. I'm sorry.
Well, I just thought of something else that might be helpful that's sort of similar, and that is, companies are always looking for what is the method to transform themselves. And so, there are different fads through the years. For 5 years, it's re-engineering. And for another 5 years, it's quality improvement and so forth. And what I keep trying to tell people, which this organization stage makes clear, is every organization has to invent transformation for itself, because if you bring in transformation off the shelf, it's not transformation. You're forcing an idea on people. They haven't invented it themselves. I mean, of course, it's possible to learn from other people's experience and other companies' experience, but when you create a program out of it and bring it to another company, that's the beginning of the end of the usefulness of that innovation. So sometimes people feel depressed by this message because they say, oh, there's no answer out there. And I say, yes, that's right. There can't be an answer because everybody's in a different situation at a different time with different employees. You have to invent it out of the dilemmas that you experience. Now we're getting I'm getting a lot of feedback. That's gone away now.
Вопросы? Questions in Russian?
Или у меня, да, вопрос.
Alexander, maybe you speak English, or you more comfortable in Russian?
No, it's possible to take the question in English. So I have the question about the progressing and regressing from one stage to other stage. When people going from, for example, transforming to, for example, redefining, that's in the half of the way from these stages. That will be the combination of the leader. Is it more... Давайте лучше я так сформулирую. При переходе, допустим, с одной ступени на другую, где-то на половине пути получается то, что произведена комбинация из этих качеств лидера. Есть ли обозначение какого-то этого периода?
Good question. Alexander is asking, during the process of transformation and growing from one stage to the next, somewhere in the middle of the way, person may adopt some of the qualities of a new stage, but still keep, be somewhere hanging in the middle. So could you comment on this kind of a situation and suggestions as to how to handle it?
Yeah. Well, this is a very good question indeed. And of course, that always happens. I mean, many of us are in between action logics, so to speak. Now, one of the ideas in the theory, and that seems to me true based on all my experience, is that we keep all the earlier action logics. We still have the ability to be an opportunist, a diplomat, an expert, an achiever, and so forth. So you'll see people acting from different action logics in any given day of their life. So the main action logic is just what we call the center of gravity, but it's imitate them and act like them, and then we kind of become an expert in the new stage where we know the language really well, and in fact we make other people very irritated because we talk about this new thing we're discovering, and we bore everybody else because we're so excited about our development. And then we actually become an achiever in the new stage, even if it's a later stage than achiever. We become pretty good at it. And then we realize, but we're not really doing it fully yet. We need to understand it more deeply than at an achiever level. So it is very easy to get stuck in between stages, or to only go halfway because it's only encouraged in certain environments and not others. A very traditional thing is for people to be experts at work but diplomats at home. That because there's too much at risk to have a fight with your wife or your husband. At work, it doesn't matter quite as much. It's better to get fired than to get divorced. So the pain doesn't last quite as long if you're fired as if you get so people do stay in between stages, or they're in one stage in one part of their life and another stage in another part. So the more you learn about this theory, the more complex it appears. It's like a fractal theory, if you know, like the fractals in mathematics, where no matter at a large scale it looks like this, and if you look at a very small scale it still looks the same way. So you can apply the theory, and when you ask what's in between these two stages, well, a whole set of stages are in between the two stages. Of course, only a real true believer in a theory like myself could believe that, but
Bill, do you have any idea how much the environment in which one operates affects these changes? In other words, I want to dance at the moon, but you won't let me dance because you are the kind of corporation that's going to hold me back from doing what, I would like to do to help you innovate. So the environment itself, whether it's the leadership or the culture or the heritage or the success of the company, because many successful companies think, well, we've got it down, but they then fail, as we know with IBM, etc. So I'm just wondering, how much the environment is also critical to this progression of each individual.
Well, it's a very paradoxical thing when you start thinking about it from the point of view of this theory. The early stages are very affected by the environment. I mean, the diplomat is completely concerned with matching. I have to act like the environment wants me to. And as we know, even the expert and the achiever, it's already defined what success is, what's good, what's a perfect score on a math test. It's already known beforehand. So the environment is tremendously influential in terms of the early action logics. Now, by the time you get through the redefining action logic after achiever and are fully in the transforming action logic, the idea of that action logic is that one has the capacity to influence the environment and to transform the environment. So, but obviously it's not that the environment has no influence on the person at the transforming action logic, but the idea is that the person doesn't feel like a slave of the environment. They recognize that even though the environment is sending messages of a certain sort, that my own attention is so disciplined that I can be aware of places where the larger company is actually failing, and if I can do it the right way, I could have an influence on the company and improve the company. So you won't find somebody at the transforming action logic saying, I can't do this because of the environment. They may say, it's very difficult because of the environment, and it requires all my creativity to find out how to jujitsu transform the environment. So the simple answer, I guess, is that the environment plays a smaller and smaller controlling aspect as you get to the later action logics. But it's partly because you become attentive enough that you realize the environment isn't just saying one thing. The environment is full of mixed messages. And if you can take the ones that support your point of view and show how they would help the company to take those into account more, you may succeed in changing the company.
Thank you. Very good answer.
Bill, in your article, the 7 transformations of leadership, you discussed Joan Bavaria and Jenny, and both of these individuals left the organizations and created their own. Is there a conflict between individuals as they go up to the higher levels, that they become frustrated with the organizations and feel that they don't need the organization to achieve their own personal satisfactions?
Well, as I said earlier, often people who move toward redefining do leave the organization. Joan Bavaria was an artist before she became a banker first, and then decided to form her own organization. So she already had a kind of creative personality and a corporate personality. And in a way, in creating her own organization, she brought those two together. I think there is some tendency for people to want to either create their own thing or find the unusual organization that they can work in. When I left Yale with my doctorate, I had a number of choices of schools I could be a faculty member at, and of all of them, I chose the one that had the lowest reputation at that time, but it was because it had a new dean who had a philosophy of action learning, and it seemed to me that it was most likely to support my work and be a good environment for me. So I wasn't starting my own organization, but I was throwing my hand in with an organization. People were saying, well, why, if you've been offered a position at Columbia and Northwestern, why do you choose Southern Methodist University? So that was a little bit like that. It's not a very complete answer, but
I hate to say that, but we are already beyond the agreed time.
Well.
So we would have to end this wonderful session, right? Because you probably have other engagements.
well, I hope it was useful.
It was great, and in a couple of months we could resume and do another one, hopefully.
Maybe so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you much, Bill.
Thank you
Thank
very
you all for hanging in there. All right.
Great.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Александр, по поводу русского языка, мы